to interviewing my family members for final exams. This is my sibling Maeve. Maeve, could you introduce yourself to my professor?
Hello, I am Maeve. I use they, them, and he, him pronouns, and I am Daniel's older sibling.
Yeah. So Maeve, as I understand, you read my midterm, right?
I sure did, Daniel. I read your paper on hybrid masculinity.
All right. And what do you think? Can you give me some initial thoughts?
Yeah, I thought that it was a really interesting way to approach the article, that you kind of broke down their arguments and presented arguments of your own that felt very coherent and relevant to kind of both the piece itself, but also knowing that your paper was written a couple decades after that original article, that there were all of these other ways that things had changed since that piece was published.
Could you tell me a little bit about the things that changed?
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed specifically was your thing on hip-hop culture, and how you had written that, and I think this was a little bit of an extension of what they were saying about the hybridization of masculinity, going from this hegemonic white masculinity to hybridizing with components of African American culture and Black masculinity. And I think that one of the things that you wrote about
What? Continue.
that you wrote about
Sorry, Professor, my mom was going through her Spotify rap.
that you wrote about how for you, like when you got into hip-hop and rap, it wasn't trying to put on another form of masculinity so much as it was hip-hop and rap are already the dominant like cultural musical forms, especially for boys. This was something we were all just arguing about moments before starting this. That's about true. The Spotify wrapped wrap-up playlists and what kinds of people listen to what kinds of music. But what you had said about there being this normalization of rap culture as being very masculine, as well as I really liked your analysis of Kendrick Lamar's work, where you said that for like even a casual hip-hop listener can't really escape the themes of violence against Black Americans in hip-hop. That pretty much every hip-hop artist dissects issues of racism in their work, and that hybridizing one's masculinity through absorbing other culture is always going to mean absorbing other viewpoints as well.
Yeah. Okay, so enough praise about me and my great essay. Maeve, Jesus. We can edit this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, we're gonna edit this. So, Maeve, I wanted to ask you about if you have seen any of the, I wanted to ask you if you've seen any aspects of non-binary or transgender masculine identity, like parts of those identities being co-opted or hybridized by straight white young males, and how that's impacted you.
Yes, I think that one of the things that's been interesting within kind of my generation / age group is the invention of the soft boy was very much a thing that happened around like I started college in 2014, and that was kind of the first time that people started talking about that. And for that, a soft boy is a boy who kind of rejected the more masculine tropes, like was not a jock, was not like big and strong and tough, but was kind of quiet and gentle, maybe painted his nails, definitely rode a bike, probably like read poetry or something. That there were these ways that these other things that could be considered feminine or masculine, poetry being one of those things that really goes either way depending on what kind of person you're talking to. But that these kind of these like signifiers, especially these kind of like stylistic ones that were used to kind of present a more soft masculinity or a kind of a queerer masculinity too. There is this association of like nail polish as being very like queer and like piercings, that these were used to kind of disarm people, namely especially women, but to kind of imply that, oh, I'm not like those guys, so I'm safer. And that just kind of became this fallacy that I think has become more understood now since people first started addressing that the way a man presents does not necessarily change the way that he actually acts towards people, kind of like what you were saying in your paper about how actions always speak louder than words. They also speak louder than appearances.
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that has happened is kind of the rise of the like femboy on like TikTok or whatever, like just some boy in a skirt wearing a little skirt to get more views, essentially. But this, and while that it is good that people of different genders and sexualities present in more experimental ways and kind of absorb these other styles and things, like that absolutely is what the, like, if there was a transgender agenda, it would be kind of like destroying gender roles and binaries and like categorizations. But in the moment that we're in right now, what happens a lot is that we see these kind of, like, there have definitely been cases of like these boys putting on skirts and being like, oh, but I'm straight, I would never date a man.
Yeah.
And that there's this kind of assumption built in then that the presentation is going to change someone's sexuality somehow, which further stigmatizes both trans people and like gay people by kind of associating like different types of femininity and masculinity as something you can just put on.
Yeah. So your note about how these femboys putting on skirts can lead to the stigmatization of gay and transgender people. So I'd actually like to lead that into one of the main arguments of the paper, in which they were saying that there's three mainstream arguments on hybrid masculinity. One, that it's not a thing, it's not widespread. Two, it is a thing, it's widespread, but it's overwhelmingly positive. And three, that there's it's widespread, but it's negative for those minority masculinities. So I wanted to ask you, how would you, so based on the queer and transgender masculinities being stigmatized, you would agree with the latter, or the third category, right?
In a way, and kind of related to that, recently there was a big deal where Harry Styles was on the cover of, I believe, Vogue, and he wore a dress, and it was a really big deal because it was the first time like a man had worn a dress on the cover of Vogue, and there were all of these articles being written about Harry Styles being this gender fluid icon, where he is a gender non-conforming icon, but he himself is not a gender fluid person. Like, that's an identity. And so that was an example in which like this kind of embracing of a more hybridized masculinity that embraced both aspects of femininity and masculinity kind of blurred the lines between what was actual like queer representation and what was a fashion moment, because that's the other thing, is it's Vogue magazine. It's a fashion magazine. It's meant to portray these like trends and styles and fabulous clothing. And if you look through the pages of any fashion magazine, you could argue that any male model has some kind of like hybridized masculinity, probably. But what that doesn't, it doesn't necessarily normalize a man in a dress. It normalizes a pop star in a dress.
True. But you would say that you said earlier that like the whole or like one of the transgender agenda is to kind of destroy gender norms and break down gender and sexuality. So Americans, as you know, we all know, are a very celebrity and pop culture obsessed society. We can't get enough of it. And we specifically look to our celebrities, probably more so than we should, to see what we should do with our lives and what's right and what's wrong. And um, so would you say that a pop star, like you said, it normalizes a pop star in a dress, but do you think that it could, I don't know, normalize not just a pop star? Like, is that a bad thing?
I don't think it's a bad thing, and I think that to me the problem was more with the coverage of it, less so than the fact of Harry wearing a dress. And I think to me, I'm also thinking of there was I don't know why I know this off the top of my head. There was this like editorial spread of Brad Pitt in the early 2000s where he's wearing a little sequin dress. You have,
how did you know that off the top of your head?
there are other situations in which like famous men have worn dresses or dressed very femininely. I mean, you have people like Bowie, you have like all these other like big celebrities who get to kind of, because celebrities especially get to play with roles, they get to kind of step outside of things because they're kind of acting, they have these personas, but these coverages of them don't like it's still a very privileged form of gender experimentation that doesn't necessarily trickle down. Did you know anyone who spoke to you about Harry Styles in a dress on the cover of Vogue?
I did not.
Exactly. And we did. In part
my
because our
other sister,
Honor is filming, and
manning the
she
camera.
was within the. She's a big Harry Styles fan.
She's a huge Harry Styles fan.
And so, like people I knew, people in my circles and people in Honor circles were both very in tune with that coverage, because the people in my circles, I have a lot of trans friends, and a lot of friends who were saying, for example, oh, I'm a trans man. I use he, him pronouns. I have been using he, him pronouns exclusively, and I have a name that is pretty much exclusively used for men. And if I were to wear a dress, no one would think, oh, how cool and punk. They would think that is a woman. And or people would say, oh, are you faking being trans? Is a thing that happens, is that there are, and this is part of this is like an inter-trans community argument of people disagreeing on how people should present so that the trans community is legitimized. And I think that it's all these really complicated layers to it that while Harry being in a dress can normalize it, and the kids on TikTok buying skirts clearly is normalizing it because there keep being more of them.
Yeah.
Are any of them wearing the skirts to school? Probably not.
Yeah.
And they know why they're not. And I think, like, you and I both know why they're not either. Even if people weren't openly harassing them, there would be the whispers, there would be the comments, even the teachers might, who probably don't mean to, but we're not used to that in American culture. We're used to, like you said, certain things existing on a pedestal and not for the average person.
This was really interesting, and it actually reminded me of, there's a artist named Future, and back in I think it was 2013 he released an album, and on the album he was wearing it seemed to me like a Japanese
it was kind of like a kimono dress thing. No, I remember that, and
nobody talked about it in the same way that Harry Styles was talked about.
People did talk about it. I was a senior in high school when that came out.
That's true.
I was probably a little more in tune to the cultural discussion around that.
I was in 8th grade.
Yes, but people definitely talked about it, and there were all kinds, but the conversations were very different. And I think, again, another huge difference there, Harry Styles is white.
They
make very different music. Yes, exactly. People interviewed Future's then girlfriend or fiance or baby mom or whatever she was at the time.
Knowing Future, it was probably a baby mom.
It was unclear if they were like engaged. And Young Thug did the same thing.
I think it was actually Young Thug. It was Young Thug.
It was Young Thug, but people interviewed his like girlfriend and the mother of his child about how she felt about him being in a dress, and she was like, "The hell do you mean? He looked good," and people were shocked by this. And like you said, this was only about 7 years ago, and but he got so much more flack, and there was not the same kind of coverage of like, oh, this is iconic. Like there were people thinking it was iconic, but there were a lot more people really trying to tear it down, and he, I think, ended up speaking about it and being like, yeah, that was like a bad experience for me. It was really uncomfortable to have my like presentation so attacked when at the end of the day, like, he looked very cool, and it was a very artistic album cover, which was clearly the point. And then I think that, like, jumping ahead to now with Lil Nas X and the way that he dresses and the things that he wears to awards shows.
That is true.
He's, I think, directly credited that Young Thug album cover as giving him the inspiration to be more flamboyant with his style. And so there are these ways that, like, and Young Thug, there were all these speculations on Young Thug's sexuality too,
Yeah.
which Harry Styles has been having speculations on his sexuality since long before the Vogue thing.
He's been having honor knows this very well.
But again, it's got to do with the fact that, like, whenever a man wears, like, a different, like, hybridizes his masculinity, I think it seems to be, people immediately start to associate that with queerness. And while that, I see the logical progression to a certain extent, it's not accurate. And, like, a gay man could wear the exact same outfit as you, and a straight man could be wearing a dress, and it wouldn't change their sexuality.
It would.
It would just be how they felt like dressing that day.
That's true.
And I think that what happened, what we've both been kind of talking about is also the coverage of these things. That while, for example, the Young Thug thing did trickle down in a way to at least one person to inspire him to be more out, Lil Nas X also wasn't out of the closet until shortly before releasing Old Town Road, like last year, to his family members.
Yeah.
And so there was still this undercurrent, especially as he spoke of it, especially within the Black community that he grew up in, of homophobia. That there were all of these homophobic and very transphobic remarks about Young Thug in a dress, about any man putting on a dress. And it can still be treated as kind of a joke or something that wouldn't really be serious. And I think that, like, if we were to turn on, I know the Grammys just happened, but if we had turned on the Grammys and
I think it was actually the AMAs. I was wrong about that.
Whatever. If there was some, like, if we're turning on the Grammys and Harry Styles is there in a dress, and so are 3 other random men, then I would say that has started to trickle down and become a trend that exists outside of kind of, like, conversations between trans people and these, like, queer identities. And it would also seem to me to then be more of, like, a fashion trend. But relatedly, the Met Gala, like, a year or 2 ago, the theme was camp. I think maybe 2 men showed up in dresses, and Harry Styles, I wear that outfit out regularly. It was just a lace top. It was boring. And, like, to me, and, like, there was such a misunderstanding of what camp meant on this level, that I think really spoke to the...
To me, camp means, what's that movie? Dr.
Rocky Horror Picture Show was the perfect example of camp. That is extremely campy. And none of those people were dressed to that level of camp, really. Yeah. And I think that, like, it's partially this way that, like, queer culture is becoming more mainstream, and it's losing a little bit of its edge, because a lot of queer culture really, I mean, Stonewall was a riot. There a lot of queer culture as it was formed in the 80s and 90s was against heterosexual and the hegemonic masculinity that we know now.
And do you think that, sorry to interrupt,
no.
but I do want to bring it back to to how, do you think that, like, Harry Styles, this gay culture, you know, all that, do you think that like is slowly becoming part of the hegemonic masculinity?
That I think it might be a little bit. Like, I think that
like, do you think...
I would say that, okay, so just off the top of my head, ear and nose piercings are much more normalized for men now.
That's true.
And those, like, in the 90s, especially ear piercings, have always been kind of considered, like, oh, which one's the gay ear?
Yeah, I that was up to, like, senior year for me.
Oh, yeah. No, and I think that, like, but we're starting to see some of this, I think, because there's the mixing also of, like, punk and queer culture, and of course both of those really can, a lot of them, be attributed to drag culture and to black balls specifically. That these masculinities, like, are hybridizing and are coming up into the hegemonic masculinity. But we're also, of course, seeing all kinds of backlash against it with the terms like soy boy online. These kind of, like, who's that guy that's only eating meat? Jordan Peterson.
Who?
there was some guy in Russia who is like, I'm only eating meat because I won't be gay.
That's
yeah.
Dude,
and
I heard eating meat or not eating meat was really gay.
yeah, like literally, it was just so weird. And like, yeah, like basically. And so there's all these ways
Dude,
that
vegetables are gay, bro.
vegetables are the gayest possible thing. But there's all of these things that like, I mean, people assume I'm a vegetarian all the time, and I'm like, do you just mean that I look gay?
We might be onto something.
I know, but there's this like assumption but there's all these like weird assumptions about like eating and like the way that like the things that people drink, what kind of drinks do you order?
Yeah.
Those have to do with how masculine you are. Like a beer is masculine, a pink drink is feminine. Like a cocktail.
Dude, the pink drinks taste the best though.
They taste the best though.
But I would never order one at a bar. I wouldn't.
Exactly. And there's all these ways that like as the hegemonic masculinity is shifting and expanding ever so slightly, I think what we're actually seeing is that other forms of masculinity and are kind of taking root, as well as I think that we're also in an era of like femininity specifically being celebrated.
So
there's millennial pink, for example.
So another interesting point that the article brought up was that this incorporation of like femininity, and I'm gonna use sensitivity as a feminine trait of masculinity, but they were saying that it's stuff like that becoming mainstream leaves behind the blue collar workers, black masculine people, just a lot of not like the old hegemonic, or
the fringes of the old hegemony.
Yeah.
Yes,
and
because
I would want to say though, I do want to say it's kind of ridiculous that they're saying essentially that blue collar workers and black people can't be sensitive.
Yes. Yeah, no, so I was going to address that point. I think that, like, yes, I think that the assumption that, like, lower class blue collar workers and black men don't have sensitivity, don't have the experiences of emotional sensitivity, is obviously rooted in these kind of classist and racist assumptions. However, the statement that, as a whole, the masculinity in those groups is enforced via discouraging sensitivity and emotional like sensitivity specifically is definitely very real. Did you ever watch Moonlight with us?
I haven't watched.
So that's a great example of both it being an impoverished black gay man who is very, very masculine, and this kind of commitment or this kind of change through his life of like some people being like, oh, you're too sensitive, and there is someone else who kind of like he asks them like what a faggot is, and the stepdad is like, did somebody call you that? Like, fuck them, and like we will always like you're too good for that, essentially, kind of. And so it's this like rare moment in this kid's life where he doesn't really have any men as role models at all otherwise, but even more importantly, there is this masculine role model who kind of makes the point to say like that's bullshit, which is counterintuitive to everything else this kid has heard growing up. And even then, I mean, the whole movie basically it takes him until he's like in his 30s to even like go after the man that he's had feelings for since he was a child, because of obviously homophobia, but because the homophobia is rooted in this like the masculinity and homophobia are intertwined in a lot of ways. But also what I was going to say is that, like, speaking of black masculinity being left behind, if you were to kind of show the average American, like, a couple pictures of, like, who looks threatening, I think that on a scale you might see the more hybridized masculine, like, soft boy down on the end. But as I mentioned, I now fully associate those with, like, creeps and abusers. And if you were to show them like a black football player, that is who, I mean, we know this from like the rash of police violence, there are these associations with a hypermasculine black man. When probably just a gardener. And like, there are these ways that kind of upholding people like Harry Styles as being these new forms of men, when there are people like Lil Nas X who are flamboyant. I mean, Harry Styles is also flamboyant constantly, but Lil Nas X is also openly gay.
That's true.
And he doesn't receive the same kind of attention for his experimentation with his looks. That there are these ways that, like, marginalized, well, and I mean, I think also that marginalized people are always going to be marginalized in some ways, that, like,
it's in the label.
Yeah, it's in the label, and that, like, the shifting terrain of masculinities in American society is always going to be reliant on the interplay of class and race, and that, like, for example, like, we are well off, and so it is safer and easier for me to experiment with gender presentation because I know that I have a loving family who supports me as well.
We do love you a lot.
Is well educated and has the money to buy me different clothes and things. Yeah. It's a weird way of putting it, but, like, whereas, and I also am, like, old enough and financially stable enough that I could buy myself a binder. Whereas, like, a blue-collar trans masculine person cannot. Yeah. And then they cannot access that thing that might not only help with their dysphoria, but could help them pass, could help them safely be more masculine or be perceived as masculine. Yeah. And that changes that.
So I wanted to end this interview with one final question. So you're a person who is on the, I would say, not on the boundaries. You're a Venn diagram of gender.
I love that. I'm gonna steal that. Thank you.
And I wanted to ask you. So we've been talking about, you know, hybrid masculinity, but is there such a thing from your experience as hybrid femininity?
I think, based on my understanding of the paper and based on our conversations about race and class in particular, yes. And I think that an example would be Lana Del Rey, kind of plumping up her lips, wearing big hoops, kind of doing her hair, and wearing these, like, when she started doing, like, just the top button on her shirt, or, like, kind of getting into, like, chola fashion, into this fashion that was really embraced by, like, lower class or gang affiliated Mexican women in Southern California, that she hybridized. Her name is Elizabeth Woolridge Grant, and she is from, like, New Hampshire. Her daddy is very wealthy. Yeah. They were already in the music production industry, and she went to, like, boarding school. Yeah. And Lana Del Rey's music does not give you that impression.
It does not.
She has hybridized her own experience of femininity, and there are parts of it that are very true to her own experience. Yeah. But she's hybridized it with this working class femininity and this kind of racially ambiguous femininity too. And that does not necessarily make chola culture and style more popular. It makes Lana Del Rey more popular.
I like that. Actually, I know I said I was going to end the interview, but that brought up one more
excellent
question. So do you think that America has been described as a melting pot, yes. And some people don't like that anymore, and they've tried to change it to salad bowl. But regardless of what food dish or cooking thing you call it, it's what matters is that it's an extremely diverse country. There's no other country on earth that is as diverse as the United States. Do you think that the United States' diversity contributes in any way to more hybrid masculinity and hybrid femininity than maybe you'd see in, I don't know, Europe or Latin America?
I think so. I mean, I think that with the advent of the internet and the kind of, like, mingling of people worldwide and, like, absorbing different, like, people can absorb similar things across the globe. But I do think that, like, the American society is a unique experience of, for example, like, I think that a lot of that kind of hybrid masculinity, soft boy type thing I was describing comes from skater culture, which is American.
That's true.
Like, that is very American. And I don't know if that has anything to do with American diversity, but, like, there are things that, and like I was saying, like, Lana Del Rey pulling from both kind of these, like, Mexican-American aesthetics, as well as she also, like, has been known to wear Native American headdresses, to kind of pull in these other femininities, as well as she actually pulls in a lot of, like, other masculinities into her work sometimes. And so there are these ways that I think that American culture, there are so many different cultures that people can kind of pull from and refer back to, that I do think that that contributes to a very different understanding of masculinity and femininity here than even, say, in Britain.
Well, Maeve, I'd like to thank you for your time. You were a
Yeah.
wonderful guest. I'd also like to thank you, Professor,
Thanks.
because I would literally never have been able to have a conversation like this if I hadn't taken this class. So I really appreciate that.
This is definitely the longest and smoothest conversation we've ever had about gender. Thank you, Honor.
Yeah, I would like to give a